The first 3 Resident Evil games on the original PlayStation are easily some of the best survival horror games ever, and every single one is a masterpiece on its own. But which of the 3 is truly the best and can solidify its position as the peak of the original Resident Evil trilogy? Resident Evil 1 as the pioneer of the formula, Resident Evil 2 as an amazing sequel, or Resident Evil 3 as the most action-packed and intense of them all? Let's find out! Released in 1996, the first Resident Evil can easily be referred to as the birth of survival horror as we know it today. Taking ideas from previous horror games like Alone in the Dark and Capcom's own Sweet Home, they managed to make one of the most influential horror games of all times and pretty much perfected the formula on their very first try. The key item hunt is incredibly fun, especially because the mansion opens up beautifully and probably better than in every single other Resident Evil game. The gunplay is very satisfying with good hit feedback and a very simple but effective loadout, considering you only get the knife, handgun, shotgun, grenade launcher and magnum for most of the game, which is only a handful of the weapons you get in something like Resident Evil 4 or 5. And by the way, all of these recurred in almost every single Resident Evil game since then, so I'd argue it's pretty clear how good of a selection these were. They just make for great fun and the gunplay feels arguably as good as it could for its time. Additionally, the Spencer Mansion is one of the most iconic and unique horror locations to this day, with its eerie bright colors, maze-like corridors and nonsense layout. In addition, there's a great roster of enemies and bosses that are just as iconic. I mean, obviously there are the stereotypical zombies, dogs and hunters, but I would even argue that every single Resident Evil fan has seen Yawn or the Tyrant at least once somewhere. And that's not just because it was the first game, but because all of these designs are just that good and are integrated perfectly. No enemy or boss feels like it's just there because they didn't know what else to put there, and the game does a great job at using the different enemies to make the game progressively harder. This aspect also makes it the most beginner-friendly of all the fixed camera angle games, considering most of them after just throw you into the action immediately. Additionally, the mansion layout is easy to learn thanks to its gradual progression, and the puzzles are neither boringly easy nor frustratingly hard. Considering these aspects, Resident Evil 1 basically provided the perfect blueprint on how a Resident Evil and survival horror game should play and look like, while also doing a perfect job at it itself. And you could do a perfect job too, if you haven't already. Apparently, a lot of you haven't subscribed yet, even though you watch the videos, so please do so if you're enjoying this one. Thank you. 2 years later, Resident Evil 2 came along and it did pretty much everything better on the first glance. Instantly noticeable are the vastly improved graphics with more detailed backgrounds and character models, as well as higher definition CGI cutscenes. Apart from that, the storytelling is drastically improved with more believable characters, dialogue and voice acting. I personally also think that the whole story is much more entertaining and dark in general though, because although Resident Evil 1's story is somewhat serviceable for the game, it's neither something special nor particularly good, although it's pretty funny. Anyway, looking at the gameplay side of things, Resident Evil 2 is also a bit longer due to the multiple scenarios, has a better soundtrack, greater enemy variety and more weapons. The game also added much better unlockables and bonus games like the Fourth Survivor and unlimited ammo weapons, which are a major improvement from the few weapons and outfits from Resident Evil 1. So it's pretty obvious that the second game drastically improved a lot over the first, but that doesn't make it automatically the best so far, because the game also lost some of the biggest strengths from the first game. The RPD is arguably equally iconic as the Spencer Mansion, but lost a lot of the creepy, uncanny feel due to the better and more realistic looking graphics. It's very apparent how a lot of the bright, rather unrealistic colors are replaced with more grounded and realistic looking places. I mean, don't get me wrong, the RPD is far from being a realistic looking police station, but still closer to a somewhat believable place than the Spencer Mansion. Furthermore, there's also a lot more ammo, more enemies and easier puzzles. Apart from that, they also removed stuff like the story choices and different endings from Resident Evil 1, but there's the zapping system which pretty much replaces these, so I wouldn't say that this is necessarily worse. But simultaneously, the game is arguably less beginner friendly as well. Resident Evil 1 gives you plenty of time to learn the controls and how the gameplay flows before throwing harder enemies at you. Here you literally spawn in a horde of zombies and have to start running instantly if you don't want to die. This is perfectly fine and good if you have played other tank control games, but can be difficult to conquer if Resident Evil 2 happened to be your first. Overall, I'd say that Resident Evil 2 is a perfectly executed game as well and can be considered the better game in almost every aspect. But the choice of having just a bit less of the slower survival horror of the first game and more action makes preferring one game over the other not as easy of a choice as it may seem at first. Resident Evil 3, as both the last entry of the trilogy and the last mainline game on the PlayStation 1, went in a very interesting direction as well. It expands greatly on the more action-oriented side of Resident Evil 2, with an insane amount of enemies, a never seen before amount of explosions, and faster and more fluid controls, including a new dodge, quick turn, and the ability to actually use steps and not just go up and down like a robot. I mean, look at it! You can walk on them yourself! Additionally, you can now craft ammunition, and there are new weapons and ammo variants, like the new mine thrower and freeze rounds, that greatly impact how you can approach enemies. There's also a significant change in pace. While the previous two games only had you visit a few distinct areas, you are now running around the whole town, including the streets, restaurants, gas stations, park, power station, hospital, clock tower, dead factory, RPD, office, and even more. You're basically constantly visiting some new places, and the variety is insane. But even though these elements push the game to be even more action-oriented than Resident Evil 2, there's also an interesting opposite to this trend, because the game is simultaneously also a lot more horror and especially panic-focused again. Particularly the introduction of Nemesis as a seemingly ever-present and extremely strong threat did a lot to properly bring back the horror. He shows up unexpected and rises the tension with his very fast movements, strong weapons, and even just the accompanying soundtrack and sounds. Nemesis really brought the game to another level in this regard and does a lot to differentiate the game from the rest of the trilogy. Additionally, the game slows down regularly with harder and more complex puzzles than even back in Resident Evil 1. Seriously, many puzzles from Resident Evil 3 are still considered one of the hardest in the whole series, and for a reason. Most of them get randomized on every new playthrough, require attention to details from files and the environment, and are much more versatile than the simple button pushing previously. But apart from the puzzles, there are also plenty of other instances where significant parts of the game can change based on RNG. Will the enemies be hunters or just zombies? Will I get the Magnum or grenade launcher? Will Nemesis show up now or later? This makes for great replayability and again differs greatly from Resident Evil 1 and 2. Just like the added life selection system. Although some choices were present previously as well, you now get the option to choose between different options that heavily impact the gameplay and endings, and usually involve to either fight Nemesis or run away. The system can dictate where you meet certain characters, what happens to some of them, open different paths, change puzzles, and so on. All these aspects make Resident Evil 3 arguably the most unique of the trilogy. The gameplay is by far the most diverse, the action is the best and perfectly showcases the state of the city, and the horror is in my opinion the scariest of them all. But it's also not as balanced difficulty-wise and can be very overwhelming for beginners. Now, to answer the question of which game is the best, it depends on you. Resident Evil 1 is easily the most beginner-friendly of the three and simply a great survival horror game, while being neither more nor less. It's definitely the least focused on action though, so you might not enjoy it as much if you prefer the more action-oriented side of the franchise. Resident Evil 2 is an improvement in almost every area and will give you a great time. The graphics, voice acting, story and action are all better, but it also turned down the puzzles, resource management and horror a bit, so it might be less enjoyable if you like these elements in the first game. Resident Evil 3 turns up almost everything. The action, the horror, the puzzles, the resource management and arguably the difficulty as well. It's a great evolution from the previous two games, but also the worst starting point of the three, so I'd advise against playing it first. However, I advise heavily to play it at some time, because it's a good challenge and arguably the most diverse of them all. It's also my personal favorite, but who cares? Anyway, all of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, which makes it impossible to clearly crown one of them as the best. If you prefer simple but good survival horror, then Resident Evil 1 is going to be the best. If you like an incredibly polished, well-balanced horror game, then Resident Evil 2 is going to be the best, and if you like an astonishingly varied challenge that leans both into action and horror, then the third is the best. So which one is your favorite? Your best Resident Evil game of the original trilogy? Please tell me down below. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and see you next time.